Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessa J.T. Pialago, and my assigned topic is Lesson 7, Cultural Relativism. Okay. What is cultural relativism? First, relativism says what is true for you is true for you, and what is true for me is true for me. So, cultural relativism says that kung unsa ang true for you, unsa ang sakto para nimo, sakto na siya para nimo, ug unsay sakto para nako, isakto pod para nako. Then, analogously, cultural relativism would say what you believe, value, or practice depends on your culture, while what I believe, value, and practice depends on my culture. Ang cultural relativism, kung unsa man imong gituhuan, imong value, din imong practice, ga-depends sa imong culture, then while kung sa akong gituhuan, value and practice depends on sa akong kultura pod. Then, in other words, cultural relativism is the idea that a person's beliefs, values, and practices should be understood based on that person's own culture rather than be judged against the criteria of another. In other words, cultural relativism is the idea that a person's beliefs, values, and practice should be understood ato siyang sabton or irespeto based sa ilahang kaugalingon nga culture. Dili na to siya i-judge against the criteria of another culture. Stated in another way, cultural relativism is the view that moral or ethical systems which vary from culture to culture. So, ang cultural relativism, nag-view na siya nga ang moral or ethical systems ga-vary na siya gikan na siya sa atong kultura. Are all equally valid, and no one system is really better than any other. So, equal na siya og valid, and walay system nga better at taas or better than any other. This is based on the idea that there is no ultimate standard of good or evil, so every judgment about right and wrong is a product of society. Therefore, any opinion, morality, or ethics is subject to the cultural perspective of each person. Ultimately, this means that no moral or ethical system can be considered the best or worst, and no particular moral or ethical position can actually be considered right or wrong. So, this means nga no moral or ethical system nga considered nga the best or dautan, and no particular moral or ethical position can actually be makonsider jud siyang sakto or sayop. In the context of cultural relativism, the manner by which the African man should not be judged against other cultures' standards. They should be judged in the context of African culture, not in the context of Christian culture. So, in the context of cultural relativism, the manner by which ang African nga lalaki dili na to siya i-judge against other culture standards. Ato siyang i-judge in the context pod sa kultura sa mga African. Dili sa not in the context of Christian nga kultura.
So, hi everyone, I am Gisela. So, my report is all about cultural perspective versus cultural relativism. So, the cultural relativism was reported by Ms. Gisa J. Parago. So, now I am going to report the cultural perspective. So, a cultural perspective is a way of understanding or viewing a culture from its point of view. So, ang pasabot ani kay pagsabot sa tinuan o kultura sa uban nga tawo based sa ilang kagalingan nga paglantaw o batasan. So, it means trying to understand people's belief, practices, and traditions based on their culture without immediately judging them. So, pasabot ani wala ta mahinaway dayon kung lahi ang ilahang gitang bilhat. Pero nakasabot ta nganong ingon ana sila tungod na po sa ilahang tinuan o kultura. So, having a cultural perspective help us appreciate diversity and understand why people act differently. So, for example, sa Japan, mubaw sila kung na sila may nagbo. So, nagpakita ni og pagrespeto. So, sa atua, sa Pilipinas, mukamay ta or mubesa-besa or muamin or mutawag og po og opo kung natay may nagbo. So, nagpakita po ni og pag-respect. So, kung kita natay cultural perspective kay makasabota nga pareho ra silang nagpakita og respeto bisag lahi nga paagi. So, ang cultural perspective kay makatabang nato na masabtan og marespeto ang lahi-lahi nga tinuan o kultura sa kalibutan.
Key takeaways. Cultural relativism is the idea that a person's beliefs, values, and practices should be understood based on that person's own culture, rather than be judged against the criteria of another. So, this means a person's beliefs, values, and practices should be understood based on their own culture, not judged by the standards of another culture. For example, ang pagkaon ng mga insekto normal sa ubang nasod pero sa atong country may seem strange na. Second, morality is relative to the norms of one culture. That is, whether an action is right or wrong depends on the moral norms of the society in which it is practiced. The same action may be morally right in one society but the morally wrong in another. So, the same action can be morally right in one culture but wrong in another. For example, arranged marriage may be seen as moral in one culture but immoral in another. Third, the danger of cultural relativism is the idea of relativism itself. Whether an action is right or wrong depends on the moral norms on the society in which it is practiced. What is good depends on what society culture consider as good. What is bad, likewise, depends on what society's culture consider as bad. So, the problem is that relativism itself can make it hard to judge action as right or wrong universally. For example, some harmful practices might be acceptable in one culture but condemned elsewhere.
Absolute relativism itself contradictory and impossible. Absolute relativism state there are no absolute truths within absolute truth itself. So, absolute relativism contradicts itself. Example, saying itself absolutely true that nothing is absolute true contradicts itself. There's a difference between cultural perspective and cultural relativism. To have a cultural perspective, the context of their culture, having a perspective of one culture, is needed to understand people. But it does not follow that morality must be based on said culture. Example, understands why accent, culture, practice, child sacrifice. Cultural perspective does not mean you must believe in morality acceptable, rejecting culture relativism.